mensagem no QR Code.
Entendi. Tá.
Você consegue? É que você não sei, vai que ela se perde aí, né? Obrigado aí da retaguarda.
Não ia conseguir.
No WhatsApp eu te mandei agora.
Não, no WhatsApp é esse. Eu também fui no e-mail.
Não, peraí, calma. Vou te mandar de novo.
Manda pro...
Deixa eu checar,
Manda, pode mandar pro e-mail ou vai mandar pra cá?
Posso mandar por e-mail.
Manda pro
Eu
e-mail.
tô checando. Ó, o que você vai receber aí é o primeiro link. Isso, né?
Isso.
Não?
Ah, sim.
Não, nem sim. Ah, já vai, né? Quando eu clico aqui já vai. Você baixou o PDF? Por segurança? Dá para apresentar igual certinho daí?
Sim.
Ô Vinícius, tem gente ali? Tem gente aí fora ainda? Dá uma regimentada para a gente começar, por favor? Não quero demorar, não. Perder o horário. Não vai botar online.
Tem QR Code de quem não entende inglês? Porque estamos pedindo, algumas pessoas pedindo no grupo que ninguém tinha visto. Tá lá fora?
Tá lá no painel.
Eu vou ler lá então pra você.
Eu ia falar no
Porque ontem
começo.
na conferência pediram no grupo e ninguém tinha.
Ah, o arquivo online.
É, pra passar pra quem?
Mais fácil passar, se for passar por...
Mas se abrir o QR Code, vai descarregar o
Mas
link.
ontem a pessoa tava longe. A pessoa não tinha como ir lá na frente daí, sabe?
Sabe o que você poderia fazer para mim?
Mandar um link ao invés.
Pegar ali na porta
Daí eu compartilho pra...
e colar aqui, ó. Eu quero que as pessoas entrarem.
Aqui na frente,
Ele na parede, ali. Pronto, melhor. Olá, boa tarde. I'll tell them to, because if you move your slides, they can't see anymore the QR code, so they can go there and.
If everyone's looking at their phones, it's because they're looking at the presentation, not because
Yesterday, I mean. Yeah?
They're going to look at it on their phones, slides.
Yeah, because they will open the presentation and then.
Yeah, but I'm saying
Boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos, todas, todes. Bem-vindos à EASH, à USP Leste, à Escola de Artes, Ciências e Humanidades da USP. Tá baixo? É um prazer estar aqui hoje com vocês para recebermos convidadas especiais na nossa casa, numa semana bastante especial que acolheu a 4ª Escola de Ciência Avançada e Mobilidades, a SP-Mob 23. Então, a gente está numa sexta-feira após uma grande realização, para quem não teve notícia ainda, que é uma escola de formação sobre mobilidades que fazemos a cada 2 anos, em parceria entre a professora Bianca Freire Medeiros da Sociologia, entre mim e colegas esse ano da Unirio do Rio de Janeiro. Então, a gente tem essa escola de formação a cada 2 anos, que se encerrou ontem. Então, a próxima agora em 2025, provavelmente, né? Mas as atividades da semana não acabaram. Então, a gente teve a oportunidade de convidar algumas pessoas para virem, algumas professoras, especialistas, para virem dar aula para nós, nessa escola de formação, e elas toparam nos visitar na EASH também e oferecer uma conferência para o programa de pós-graduação em turismo da USP, justamente para falar da relação entre turismo e mobilidades, né? Falamos um pouco disso ontem lá na FEFELESH, no último dia da escola, né? E hoje a gente vai ter a oportunidade de ir mais a fundo nessa relação. Mas antes disso, eu queria... Posso te chamar, Aninha? Eu queria convidar a Ana Carolina para fazer algumas palavras aqui em nome do SESC de São Paulo, porque o SESC foi o nosso grande parceiro na realização dessa 4ª Escola de Ciência Avançada, para poder trazer parte dos nossos convidados para o Brasil e para São Paulo. E a Ana Carolina, além de ser mestra em turismo pelo PPG Tour, doutorando em Sociologia lá na FEFELESH, hoje aqui representa o SESC de São Paulo, e é importante que ela, enfim, fale pela instituição onde ela trabalha agora.
Oi, gente, boa tarde. É muito bom estar aqui hoje com vocês. De novo, vendo muitas pessoas queridas, rostinhos conhecidos. Eu não preparei uma fala institucional, mas a gente fica entre o limiar, né? Sou representando a instituição, mas também num espaço tão cheio de afeto, né? Então, eu queria agradecer em nome do SESC São Paulo, que desde 2000, a gente teve a primeira edição em 2017, né? Então, é um parceiro importante, através do Centro de Pesquisa e Formação do SESC, e esse ano também através do SESC Pinheiros. Então, em nome do SESC São Paulo, eu gostaria de agradecer a presença, a oportunidade e celebrar o evento, né? Que tem uma consonância muito grande também com a visão, né, da instituição. Entendendo a história do SESC, a gente entende também a visão que foi construída, sobretudo a partir da contribuição do Mazedier para a visão do lazer, né, como o lazer e o turismo como um direito, né, e também como ferramentas de educação não formal. Então, eventos como o SP Mobilities, eles reforçam e contribuem para a construção dessa visão e de atividades, né, que reconheçam a importância do turismo e do lazer como instrumentos mesmo de saúde e de educação e de desenvolvimento humano. Então, mais uma vez, vida longa, SP Mobilities, e muito obrigada.
Obrigado. Bom, gente, então, sem mais outras delongas, né, a gente está aqui para escutar a professora Jennie Germann Molza, que eu já vou apresentar daqui a pouco, mas nós também temos a oportunidade de ter conosco hoje a professora Mimi Sheller, aqui no nosso auditório, que são nomes super importantes para aqueles que estudamos mobilidades na interface com turismo ou não, né? Eu vou fazer uma rápida apresentação da ideia desse evento de hoje. E tá muito baixo? Tá bom. E vou convidar a professora Mimi para entregar algumas palavras para nós, porque ela nos visita hoje como audiência, como vocês todos, né? Mas ela representa uma instituição nos Estados Unidos que pode ser de interesse para alguns de nós aqui. E depois nós passamos para a conferência da professora Jennie, né? Algumas questões práticas. Ali no cantinho, ali no púlpito, tem um QR Code que, se vocês quiserem fotografar, vocês vão poder ver a apresentação da professora Jennie em português. Então, ela vai fazer uma apresentação em PowerPoint em inglês, mas essa mesma apresentação foi traduzida para o português e vocês conseguem descarregar por ali, né? Podem vir sem nenhum tipo de constrangimento aqui na frente, fotografar ou passar aí por WhatsApp, circular, que ela autorizou justamente essa circulação, né? O título da palestra dela é Mobilizando e Ancorando o Turismo. Reflexões na intersecção entre os estudos turísticos e o paradigma das mobilidades. Eu não vou dar muito spoiler sobre o que isso quer dizer, porque ela mesma vai fazer isso. É só para deixar bem claro que a nossa encomenda para a professora Jennie foi que ela tratasse de turismo usando as lentes das mobilidades, que é uma coisa que nos interessa muito, a muitos aqui no grupo de pesquisa em mobilidades e turismo, aqui da EASH, né? E para outras pessoas que começam ou investem nessa leitura do turismo pela perspectiva das mobilidades. Antes de eu apresentar um pouco mais de detalhes da professora Jennie, eu vou convidar a Mimi para vir aqui, porque ela vai falar um pouquinho da universidade dela, lá nos Estados Unidos. Para quem não sabe, gente, a professora Mimi Sheller escreveu, junto com o John Urry, muitos textos e muitos trabalhos que dão as bases para o estudo das mobilidades da forma como a gente tem feito, né? Numa leitura humanista, numa leitura pelas ciências sociais. E esteve conosco aqui na 4ª Escola de Ciência Avançada e Mobilidades. Já tem alguns títulos publicados sobre turismo, inclusive. Uma das obras mais relevantes para aqueles que estudamos turismo na chave das mobilidades é um livro de 2004, ainda bastante interessante, que se chama Tourism Mobilities, Places to Play, Places in Play, cujo primeiro capítulo foi traduzido e expandido numa redação colaborativa entre este que vos fala, a Camila Moraes, lá do Rio de Janeiro, e a própria Mimi, como autora. Então, se vocês forem na revista Turismo em Análise, vocês vão poder encontrar o primeiro capítulo do livro Tourism Mobilities, traduzido e expandido para a língua portuguesa, né? Hoje a Mimi está baseada numa universidade em Massachussets, ela vai explicar para vocês um pouco disso, e ela topou fazer uma apresentação rápida sobre essa instituição, para o caso de alguém se interessar, visitar, conhecer e estar por lá. Eu acho que é uma oportunidade interessante também de vocês conhecerem a professora Mimi antes de entrarmos na conferência da Jennie. Mimi Sheller, thank you so much for coming. If you can deliver some words to our audience, that would be really nice.
Thank you. Thanks, Tiago. Hello. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming and for inviting myself, and I'll speak for Jennie too, for both of us. We're so happy to be with you in person. And both of us come to you from different universities, but they happen to both be in the same town, a town in Massachusetts. It's called Worcester, and there's also a Worcester in England, but that's a different one. And my university is called Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Jennie is at College of the Holy Cross. We're right near each other. And my university, I am the dean of the Global School. And the Global School is all about encouraging student mobility and international exchange. And we require all of our students to do a global project, which is to say they travel both locally in our area and across the US and out around the world to 50 different project centers in 34 countries. and they do team-based interdisciplinary projects for 7 weeks at a time, and they travel with faculty members. We also sometimes cooperate with universities in other countries and set up projects with students at international universities, and we also welcome exchange students if anybody wants to come and visit us. So if anyone has an opportunity, if you're coming to the US, if you're thinking about where to go, if you're interested in coming to what we call WPI, and you can also come and visit Jennie at College of the Holy Cross. I left for Tiago some literature describing the programs at the university. We can pass around, you can look at. It describes the kind of learning that we do through hands-on projects. So for example, if you wanted to work with like tourism, we have students who do projects for groups that organize voluntourism or tourism projects or work in different kinds of projects that relate to travel. I'm also very interested in the whole question of the future of student travel, right? Because of the COVID-19 disruption of travel, because of the costs of travel, because of the carbon footprint of travel, there's many reasons where people say we shouldn't travel anymore. But I think students should still get to travel. It's really important to go and learn about other cultures, meet other people. And so while some of us, like me, should travel less, you all should travel more, I think. So I hope that you'll get the chance to do that. Thank you.
Ótimo. Então, assim, a Mimi e a Jennie vão ficar conosco até por volta de 4h30. Se vocês quiserem conversar com ela e com a Jennie na sequência, fiquem à vontade, aproveitem. É realmente uma super oportunidade recebê-las a ambas na nossa casa aqui em São Paulo. So, finally, let's talk about Jennie's presentation. A professora Jennie Germann Molza vem também dos Estados Unidos. A Mimi falou agora que elas trabalham na mesma cidade, né, no estado de Massachusetts, e ela trabalha numa instituição que se chama The College of the Holy Cross. E ali ela desenvolve uma série de atividades no campo da sociologia, que é a área de formação dela, de graduação, de mestrado e doutorado que ela fez na Universidade de Lancaster, lá na Inglaterra, né, sob, inclusive, supervisão, orientação da professora Mimi. Então, temos aqui uma orientadora e uma orientanda se encontrando. E a Jennie também atuou como pesquisadora de pós-doutorado lá no Centro de Pesquisas em Mobilidades da Universidade de Lancaster, que é o famoso e importantíssimo CMOR, Centre for Mobilities Research. É um dos primeiros lugares que, desde 2003, começa a se estruturar para reunir pensadores e pessoas estudando as mobilidades na chave que nós vamos estudar e entender hoje, né? E ali ela fez o seu pós-doutorado há algum tempo, sob supervisão do John Urry, né? Para quem está desavisado, o John Urry escreveu o famoso livro O Olhar do Turista, que acaba de ser traduzido novamente pela Edições Sesc em 2021 para 2022. Vocês podem encontrar esse livro nas livrarias virtuais e na própria loja do Sesc, né? Então, a gente está diante de duas pessoas que tiveram uma importância enorme na construção desse pensamento sobre as mobilidades, na perspectiva da sociologia, que conviveram com espaços e pessoas que foram e ainda são importantíssimos para a construção de um paradigma de mobilidades, como tem sido chamado, né? E, para nossa sorte, a Jennie tem feito uma série de interações nas suas pesquisas e trabalhos das mobilidades com o turismo, inclusive na chave da hospitalidade, né? Ela é uma das editoras, ou co-editoras, de uma revista que se chama Hospitality and Society, que é bem importante, e é por isso que tem esse envolvimento com temas que tangenciam sempre a relação do turismo com as mobilidades. Eu não vou dar muito spoiler, porque ela vai falar uma grande parte dos temas e projetos que ela desenvolve, mas tem, por exemplo, Global Nômades Digitais, ela fala de cidadania global, famílias que levam seus filhos para estudarem em diferentes partes do mundo, sempre nessa dinâmica complexa das mobilidades, que olham que tratam de turismo, não nas formas necessariamente como a gente está acostumado a olhar, né? Por isso mesmo que nós a convidamos, para a gente entender um pouquinho o que é possível fazer e entender sobre esse mundo do turismo usando os óculos, as lentes das mobilidades. Guardem essa metáfora. É isso que nós estamos fazendo aqui. A gente está vestindo óculos de uma área de conhecimento em construção, de um conjunto de referências, de mecanismos, de metodologias, para entender o fenômeno que nos interessa, que é o turismo. Tá? Eu vou convidar a professora Jennie para vir aqui. Ela vai fazer uma apresentação de mais ou menos uns 40, 50 minutos. Obviamente que nós vamos ter tempo de fazer perguntas. Se vocês não quiserem, não puderem fazer pergunta em inglês, não tem problema. Façam em português que a gente traduz. E colegas que estiverem do lado e conseguirem entender um pouquinho inglês, puderem eventualmente ajudar os outros, façam isso. Né? A apresentação está em português, mas às vezes alguma palavra pode ser útil de ser traduzida por quem conhece um pouquinho mais de inglês. Tá? Jennie, thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours.
Hola. I'll just start by saying thank you to all of you for coming this afternoon. I'm so delighted to see, and some many faces that I've been meeting over the past few days. Thank you all so much for your warm hospitality here. And thank you especially to Tiago and Bianca and Camila and Joao for the invitation and for making everything happen to get me here and to get Mimi here. It's been an absolute delight. So I wonder if
Do you think it's going to work?
Gambiaha? I might need that later. Okay. So Professor Tiago asked me to speak this afternoon about the intersection between tourism studies and the mobilities paradigm. And so I'm really happy to do that because it's where a lot of my work is situated. But before I do that, I need to talk a little bit about where I am situated. So the question is, where do I know from, right? So what is my positionality? So my home is in...
a bit closer, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's great. My home is in northern New Mexico, but as Professor Tiago said, I teach at a Jesuit Catholic college in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's a liberal arts school, and we only have undergraduate students there. And before I started teaching, so my home is in New Mexico, which is that picture. My work is here. So my life is kind of geographically split and therefore relies a lot on mobility to be with my family and with my colleagues. But before I started teaching at Holy Cross, I did my PhD in sociology at Lancaster University in the UK. And I was completing my PhD in 2004 just as the mobilities turn was turning, right? Just as everything was kind of getting started. And John Urry and Mimi Sheller were inaugurating the Center for Mobilities Research. And then with Kevin Hannum, they were launching the Mobilities Journal. And around this time, John and Mimi were also coordinating the edited collection that Tiago mentioned, Tourism Mobilities, Places to Play, Places in Play. And they had invited contributions from former Lancaster students, former students of John's, and somehow I got in on that. I got invited to be part of that group, and I was really just working on my PhD at the time, so it was really inspiring for me to be able to be in conversation with all of those scholars. And I was doing my doctoral research on round-the-world backpackers
And I felt like I was really kind of like at the right place at the right time, so to speak, to be able to draw on this exciting new mobilities paradigm, to think about what these backpackers were doing, because they weren't just traveling around the world, they were also creating websites while they were doing it. So I stayed then at Lancaster as a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Mobilities Research, and I started a project on couchsurfing, which is like an online hospitality peer-to-peer network. And I was interested in the new hospitality platforms that were emerging at the time. And then I continued to conduct research on travel and technology, travel bloggers, mobile smartphone apps. So, you know, when you go into a city and then you download something on your phone to guide you around, and network hospitality. And then my next big project was what I call a mobile virtual ethnography of world schooling families. So these are families who educate their children while traveling the world. I don't know if the idea of homeschooling is something very popular in Brazil, but in the United States it's quite popular. Families often don't send their children to the state or public or even private school. They teach them at home. But world schooling families teach their children while traveling around the world. And a lot of the parents in the families that I was studying were funding their travels by working remotely online wherever they were in the world. And so this then kind of piqued my curiosity about this trend of digital nomads as well. So that's what some of my more recent research has been about. And I'd say that most of my research has focused on mobile phenomena that intersect with tourism rather than on specific tourist destinations. So my research respondents also have tended to be relatively privileged, predominantly white, mostly from the global north. They tend to be professionals or entrepreneurs. And this is also the position that I occupy as a white, middle-class, US-based scholar. So this means that when I'm doing critical analysis, I'm looking at mobility and power in terms of how mobility reproduces privilege or even normalizes certain forms of privilege, and how it serves these particular travelers as a resource in pursuing their vision of the good life, right? So I'm trying to kind of name and identify how privilege gets reproduced through these mobilities. So this is the very specific angle through which I approach the intersection of tourism and mobilities. So it might seem quite self-evident that tourism is mobile or involves mobility of some kind, but what is actually happening at that intersection of tourism and mobility? And this question has been a topic of conversation, and a key moment in this conversation was the publication of that book I mentioned, Tourism Mobilities. In the description I sent for today's talk, I actually use a quote from the opening chapter to that book, which I believe has now been translated into Portuguese, so I hope some of you have an opportunity to read that. And this is where Sheller and John Urry write that tourism mobilities involve complex combinations of movement and stillness, realities and fantasies, play and work. And this observation was true when the book was first published 20 years ago, but these complex combinations, I think, are even more evident and more relevant, especially over the past few years, as the pandemic and its aftermath have kind of brought into stark relief the way that mobilities make tourism and the way that tourism makes the mobile world that we have come to know. So I am going to get to the tourism studies mobilities paradigm intersection, but I want to start by setting the scene with a story about tourism and the pandemic. And this is a story whose global plot and local subplots you are all very familiar with, I'm sure. This is a story we've lived together. But I want to tell it through this lens of tourism mobilities. And I'm going to start with some statistics from the United Nations World Tourism Organization. So in 2019, according to the UNWTO, they published this World Tourism Barometer. International tourist arrivals grew to 1.5 billion overnight visitors, which is pretty staggering. Tourism was expected to continue to grow by about 7%, but analysts didn't foresee that in 2020, the number was going to drop by 74% to just 400 million international travelers. And of course, this was because of the pandemic. And so instead of going up, we saw the numbers go back to where they were in 1990. This sudden drop in visitors kind of refashioned a lot of tourist destinations and tourist hubs into barely recognizable versions of their former selves, and they generated new myths and new kinds of icons around these destinations. So the beaches and the streets of Barcelona, which were previously over-touristed, were now empty. The water in the canals of Venice was clear. The crowds at Angkor Wat had thinned to where local residents could actually visit their own sacred site. Airports were vacant, cruise ships were docked. Without tourists there to perform them, these places were no longer happening, as Sheller and Urry put it. But once a vaccine was available, and acknowledging that it was not evenly available, not everyone had access to it, but once it was available, the tourist numbers did begin to inch back up. And in 2021, that year, a 4% increase equaled 415 million international tourist arrivals. Last year, in 2022, the UNWTO's Tourism Barometer report led with the headline that international tourism was back to 60% of pre-pandemic levels, so we see it going up. And then the report for the current year proclaimed that tourism was on track for a full recovery, as new data shows a strong start to 2023. So we should expect, it to go back up. So these statistical peaks and valleys on these charts, they give us some idea of how tourism and mobility intersected through the vector of the virus, but they fail to convey what this like roller coaster of tourism mobilities has felt like for people and for the planet. And behind these numbers is a world of tourism mobilities revolving around combinations of movement and stillness, realities and fantasies, and work and play. So with movement and stillness, so the virus was an untidy and unwelcome guest that dispersed itself around the world through tourism infrastructures of airports and airplanes, events and hotels. And from one angle, we can see how it brought tourism and travel to a standstill, and it turned hotels from a place of recreation into restricted quarantine wards. But from another angle, we can see how it mobilized tourists and tourism in new directions, reviving the staycation trend from the 2008 global financial crisis, when people couldn't afford to go on vacation, so they like partied in their backyards, and then into the 2020 trends like hashtag stay home imperative, which of course is also a moral imperative meant to curb the spread of the virus, but while still enjoying yourself somehow at home. So for the lucky ones who had money and job security, if they were planning a far-flung international vacation, that got put on hold, and instead it was replaced with going to local destinations, maybe taking an RV trip where you're safe in your own little RV bubble. For the unlucky ones without job or social security, the picture was far more grim, as quarantine protocols required immobility, or for essential workers, enforced and undesired mobility to frontline jobs. And it was especially bleak for those whose livelihood depended on tourism. But then back on the lucky side of things, professional tech and knowledge workers were thrust into new forms of virtual mobility, working, consulting, meeting, teaching on Zoom or Google Meet that allow them to pursue physical mobility to maybe a second home or a rural retreat, or to even become digital nomads because now they could do their work online. This is actually my faculty assembly. So meanwhile, we also saw a lot of special issues from tourism scholars who took this moment as an opportunity to imagine a sustainable future for tourism, because those clean water canals in Venice looked pretty nice, right? And in some cases, these scenarios were factored into future planning, or they were used to bring awareness to all of these initiatives that already existed, initiatives around ecotourism and indigenous tourism projects that stakeholders had been working on for years, and suddenly people were interested. So, so these efforts are ongoing and wonderful. But I have to say the balance of public sentiment has always been weighted more toward bouncing back than moving forward toward a decolonized, decarbonized, or decelerated future. So speaking of bouncing back, right? So after the suspension of normal life in 2020 and 2021, what does it mean to have a headline telling us that we're on track to full recovery? What does that actually look like at the intersection of, all right. Okay. Maybe I'll sound smarter now. So what does this bouncing back look like? Well, we talked about this a little bit the other day, but nowhere was this more pronounced than the somewhat disheartening trend of revenge travel that marked the summer of 2022. So as the travel restrictions were eased, millions of travelers who were able to took to the road under the auspices of taking their revenge against the virus that had imprisoned them in their homes or had canceled their trip of a lifetime. And so last summer, European destinations especially were heaving under the weight of the refugee crisis because of the Ukraine war, the oppressive heat wave, and then also on top of that, all of these revenge travelers on the trains in Europe. This year, the travel magazines are predicting a rise in set jetting. So this is a play on the concept of jet setting, which is the kinetic elite are the jet setters. But the set jetters is a post-COVID form of cinematic tourism. And it refers to travelers' desire to visit the places where their favorite Netflix shows were filmed. So Netflix programs like Emily in Paris or HBO's White Lotus. I don't know, did these programs have any popularity here? Okay. It allowed a quarantined audience to travel imaginatively while they were stuck at home during the pandemic. But once people were able to get on airplanes again, thank you, they wanted to go to Paris, and they wanted to go to Hawaii and Sicily and see where these programs were shot, apparently undeterred by the highly problematic way that these two programs, in particular, portray American US tourists and expats and their sticky encounters with local residents. Okay. And then the third combination of play and work. So another trend in the travel magazines, this one won't surprise you because it was already gaining traction before the pandemic, but this idea of the workcation, also known as bleisure or lisness. I did not make these words up. But these are very clumsy attempts at blending work and vacation, business and leisure. But of course, the real story here, I think, is the rise of digital nomadism which is a lifestyle evolving around the arrangements of work, leisure, technology, mobility, and citizenship that Sugio Makimoto and David Manners predicted back in 1997 with their book, The Digital Nomad. It's become feasible and popular in a way that they foresaw. And digital nomads aren't just blurring, is this feedback? Sorry. They're not just blurring the distinction between work and leisure, but also between tourism and immigration. Okay, so this detour through some of these travel trends that we've seen come and go over the past 4 years highlight some of the ways that tourism and mobilities intertwine to create the world as we know it, if not necessarily the world as we wish it was. So I wanted to start with these recent examples to illustrate how tourism is intertwined with mobilities in really complex ways, but also with immobilities and moorings in people's lived experiences and everyday lives. And in the title of my talk today, I'm using these terms mobilizing and mooring, borrowing from the title of the editorial that John Urry wrote with Mimi Sheller and Kevin Hannum to launch the journal Mobilities. And they write their objective was to catalyze this mobility turn that shifted the social sciences away from a territorial or sedentary perspective about what is social life and more to a mobile perspective that sees these various intersecting mobilities at the heart of the social world. And they write that these mobilities include, and I think these quotes are translated in Portuguese if you have the on your phone, both the large-scale movements of people, objects, capital, and information across the world, as well as the more local processes of daily transportation, movement through public space, and the travel of material things within everyday life. Issues of movement or of too little movement or too much or the wrong sort at the wrong time are central to many lives, organizations, and governments. So I think it's quite easy to imagine the mobility as it intersects with tourism, and it's also, we can also imagine the immobility as it intersects with tourism. But what is this mooring word, right? What does it mean to moor? And I think that Tiago used the Portuguese word ancorar for this. I looked it up myself too, and I also found atracar or amarrar and ancorar. So I don't know the nuances of those different words, but I feel like they're all getting at something similar. And Mimi talked about this a little bit last night, but the choice of mooring was to get at sort of the nautical, the sea, right? How you would moor a boat in the water. So this image shows you that little bubble there is the mooring, and you can't see it, but there would be a chain below it that goes down and is anchored down in the sand or the seabed. But that bubble can kind of move, right? And like Mimi described, it can move up and down with the water, and it can kind of move. And yet, at the same time, it keeps the boat in place, right? Not like fixed in place, but sort of in a place. But the way I also think about mooring is that it is, it's the material infrastructure that makes mobility possible as well, right? So the mooring is also kind of a launch pad or a place from which we can be propelled into movement again. So there's that just kind of constant coming into a space of mooring and leaving and into mobility. But they're intertwined at the same time. So the authors are using tourism as a key example of global mobility and the role of technology in mobility, which is something that I'm very interested in my work. But in other ways, they kind of decenter tourism. It's just one of many intersecting mobilities that make up the mobile world. So this is the paradox that I want to explore in the rest of my comments. Is tourism at the center of the mobilities paradigm or not, right? Where is tourism in the mobilities paradigm? And so I'm going to start with a couple of comments about the tourist gaze and from John Urry's work, and then talk about the way he thinks about performance and play, and then say a bit about the mobilities manifesto, and then depending on where we are with time, we can talk about mobile methods as well. So the tourist gaze, so centering tourism. I think, yeah. So is the first edition of the tourist gaze. This was published in English in 1990. This is where John Urry brought the study of tourism to the center of social sciences. At the time, things like consumption, recreation, leisure, lifestyle, these were seen as kind of like unserious topics for sociologists to be studying, right? We needed to be looking at the political and social institutions and labor and production and social class. But the way Urry described it, the tourist gaze, it's something that individual tourists did to consume and to make sense of the world around them, but it was also part of this broader like logic that governed modern life, that governed how people and places organized themselves. It ordered difference, it created difference, and it interacted with, it was how people interacted with one another in a mobile and globalized world. So Urry was showing us that tourism is not an escape from everyday life. It's not on the margins of social life. It is emblematic of the social world. In particular, he argued that tourists learn to see and consume a world that is ordered around this dualistic logic of modernity. And we probably are all familiar with these associations, right? Home versus away, or authenticity versus simulation, familiar versus strange, mundane versus extraordinary. And it's this latter point in particular is a defining feature of the tourist gaze, that it seeks to visually consume places, scenery, sites that are unique, aesthetically appealing, and above all, different from the tourist's everyday life. And so throughout the book, throughout the first edition of the book, he defines the tourist gaze as a quest for something out of the ordinary. But he ends the book on a kind of different note, suggesting that the extraordinary has become ordinary, while the ordinary has become extraordinary. So as evidence, he uses the case of Glasgow, Scotland. In 1990, Glasgow was named the 1990 European City of Culture, and it had been remade from what Urry calls a rough and depressing place into a tourist attraction. And this transformation suggested to Urry that there was no limit to the endlessly devouring gaze of the tourist, right? Like if Glasgow could be made as a tourist attraction, nothing's off limits. So is this idea, this complex entanglement of tourism with places and processes of everyday life in late modernity that Urry was then developing in his later work. So the tourist gaze may have placed tourism at the center of a sociological agenda, but then Urry started to decenter tourism. For example, he made this really provocative claim, and I know some of you have thought about this and written about this as well, about the end of tourism. And this was in his book, Economies of Science and Space with Scott Lash. And his argument, of course, wasn't that people were going to stop traveling, although during the pandemic we got kind of a very literal sense of the end of tourism for a minute. But that wasn't what he was talking about. What he was talking about was, what was ending was this notion of tourism as something exotic or extraordinary. If anything, our lives were becoming more touristic, more organized around sites of consumption and leisure and visual spectacles, to the extent that tourists are, oh wait, no, go back. that we're like tourists most of the time, whether we mean to be or not. So for example, is this a picture of an airport or a shopping mall? No one's confident to say. All of the above, right? So the prolific geographic, social, and technological expansion of tourism mobilities was blurring those distinctions and dichotomies that I showed you a minute ago between home and away, work and leisure, right? If that's what held the social order together before, that was kind of dissolving. Yeah. So Urry didn't think that tourism would stop altogether, but rather that it would come to the point where we couldn't really distinguish tourism from the other things that we were doing, that it would be nowhere and everywhere. So I liked this idea. I thought this was really interesting. This was something I wanted to explore in my own work. And so along with many other scholars, I was thinking about how technology accelerated this de-differentiation. And in my book, Travel Connections, and I brought some copies of my books to, for you all to have maybe in your library. And I can, okay, so this was Travel Connections. So in this book, I was thinking about how tourists and travelers were using technology not to like escape from home or to be away from home, but to be in touch with home like all the time while they were traveling, and how they really blended work and leisure, and they were able to make strange places feel instantly familiar by just pulling up one of those apps on their phone that told them where to eat and where to go and what to look at. As Urry continued to develop his thoughts about tourism alongside the mobilities paradigm, another concept began to emerge in his work, and that's the concept of performance. Now, I said previously that the mobilities paradigm was trying to shift us away from territorial or sedentary ideas of social life, but that does not mean that geographical locations or destinations don't matter anymore. On the contrary, as Urry's subsequent work emphasized, places matter very much. And in the book that he wrote with Jürgen Ole Berenholt, Michael Haldrup, Jonas Larsson, the Danish geographers, they wrote, if places did not exist, the tourism industry would have to invent them, or tourists would have to invent them. And in fact, they go on to argue that tourists kind of do invent them, right? Places are intrinsic for any kind of tourism. Without places to which to go, tourism would seem meaningless. Tourism is moored, to go back to that concept of mooring, tourism is moored in particular places, right? But Urry was also encouraging us now to think about how tourism mobilizes places, to think of places themselves as fluid, mobile, and performed. As Mimi Sheller and John Urry put it in Tourism Mobilities, tourism is about places to play and places in play. And the way Urry and his collaborators approached this idea was by thinking about tourist places through a performance lens. And there's this, I think, really nice alignment between tourism, the mobilities paradigm, and performance theory, which John Urry and Jonas Larsson capture in this quote. They say, the paradigms of the gaze and performance should dance together rather than stare at each other at a distance. And so in Tourist Gaze 3.0, you can see that they are drawing on Irving Goffman's dramaturgical model. They're drawing on Tim Edensor's concept of staging tourism. And they added a chapter on performance, chapter 8, to this edition of the book. And from this work, Urry and Larsson distill a list, next one, please. Thank you. 8 points as we all know, John Urry is famous for numbered lists in his books, and they distilled 8 points to consider when we think about tourism mobilities and place through a performance lens. So I want to kind of go through the list and talk about a few examples or highlights. So the first 2 points have to do with this idea that tourism is not just about gazing, that it's also multi-sensuous and embodied, which I understand is another word that's difficult to translate into Portuguese, but that like you do it with your body, right? You're actually performing tourism as an embodied being, corporeal tourism at the very least. And this is drawing quite a bit on Tim Edensor's claim that tourism is a more than visual experience. Tim Edensor was one of John Urry's students. John Urry supervised Tim's the last year of his PhD, and his doctoral thesis was about the Taj Mahal in India, and it was then published as this book, Tourists at the Taj. And in that book, Edensor he's thinking about the tourist gaze, but he's also saying that when tourists go to the Taj Mahal, they don't just look at it. They walk around it, they join a guided group, they buy souvenirs, they kind of play around a little bit on the grounds of the Taj Mahal. And this focus on tourism as performance is a reminder that tourism is embodied, affective, multi-sensuous. Edensor's work also uses performance theory to argue that tourist places are stages on which the dramas of tourism are choreographed. If you're familiar with Irving Goffman's work, the sociologist Irving Goffman, you can see the influence of that dramaturgical model here. And we see that in the third point that Urry and Larson make, which is that tourism is staged by teams of people, stage managers, actors, and audiences who enact the scripts. So each of these areas is sort of staged managed, Edensor says, in ways that provide and sustain common sense understandings about what activities should take place there. And when I was doing the research for this book, I researched the mobile walking tours that you could get on your phone to guide you around Boston, which is a city near where I work. And in Boston, we have something called the Freedom Trail, which is takes you on a historical tour through the city to see all of these sites and landmarks that were important during the Revolutionary War. And there's actually a red brick line that runs through the city that tourists follow in order to make sure they see each of the points that are important. So that's one way of stage managing the way tourists navigate the city. But now there are a lot of digital stage managers as well, right? So that tourists don't just follow the red bricks, they also follow their phones. And there's a lot of this stage management is also teaching tourists how to properly perform in the place. So some places stage performances for tourists who are positioned as the audience. So for example, when I was teaching at the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland, which is just almost as far north as you can go, almost, several of my students were either doing research on or they were working at Santa's Village, which for Rovaniemi is a famous tourist destination. And they often worked as Santa's elves. And I hope I'm not giving it away that Santa isn't real. He's an actor. Sorry. But a lot of my students worked as Santa's elves, and they would put on the performance for the tourist. And it was very convincing, especially if you were under the age of 10. And they even had to go to an elf academy to learn how to be elves. Elsewhere, these performances may take the form of exhibitions, local music or dance performances. Urry and Larson list examples like the Maori war dances, Balinese dance ceremonies, Brazilian samba is one of their examples, and hula dancing in Hawaii. All of these illustrate performances that are staged for tourists to watch, but they also speak to the inherently political, often problematic, colonial, historical narratives and the deeply contested nature of such performances. In other cases, tourists are brought onto the stage as performers themselves. So this is my son and me being at Santa's Village. Tim Edensor gives an example of an historical, like a heritage site in the UK called the Quarry Bank Mill, which was an 18th century cotton mill. And it's now this heritage attraction, and people wander around in costumes. And when they see children, they try to recruit the children to work in the mill, because in the 18th century, child labor was quite common. And so the children then play at doing child labor as part of the performance of the heritage site. I'm sure you can think of other examples that you've either experienced as a tourist or maybe one of the performers for tourists. So one of the things that Urry and Larson really want to emphasize, though, is that even though these performances are often scripted and managed, they are never complete, right? They're never predetermined. There's always room for the tourists to kind of do something a little bit different. And Tim Edensor writes about this at the Taj Mahal, and he says that there is a proper way of doing the Taj. You're supposed to gaze at the building with a romantic gaze, and you're supposed to appreciate the seriousness of the history of the building. But that a lot of times the visitors actually just play around. They're what Urry calls a post-tourist. They kind of play with the site a little bit. So instead of enacting it in the proper way, they enact it in a more playful way. And so they will defy the norms. So this is kind of an irreverent way of like performing the Taj Mahal. So this might be defying the norm. But then this becomes a new norm. And the next one. And the next one. And then somebody decides to play with the new norm. And so it's like so creative, right? And fun. And this interplay between tourists and places through these performances, brings us to what I think is the really interesting argument. This kind of more ontological insight about the nature of places, that they're not just pre-existing stages or distinct containers for tourism performances, but rather they are an effect of the performances. In other words, places are not static locations, but are fluid and mobile. They are places, performances, and tourism are all co-constituted and constantly becoming. So Sheller and Urry write that if the performances by hosts and guests no longer happening, then the place stops happening. So places can fall off of tourist itineraries, they can fall off of the global map, they can no longer be in play. This also means that places are performed in relation to other places. So for example, in an article I wrote called Performing Global Geographies, I show how the round-the-world travelers, they compare places to each other. They decide which places are worth how much time, or they sequence places into an itinerary that reflects enough cultural and geographical differences to count as global, right? But that's only because of the way they're like comparing and relating the places to each other. So Urry writes that places are not so fixed, but implicated within complex networks that need to be examined. They're more like ships that move around and are not fixed within one location. Okay, so sorry, I have the citation is not correct here. This is actually from Hannam, Sheller, and Urry. I changed it on the Portuguese version, so you should have the correct one. They say that these complex networks include hosts, guests, buildings, objects, and machines that are contingently brought together to produce certain performances. And this comment about buildings and objects brings us to the sixth point, which is that tourism places are hybrid assemblages. They're a complex web of physical elements, material objects, technologies, but also symbolic meanings. So places afford certain kinds of performances. There are certain things that you can do in one place that you can't really do in another place. So you can, the example that Urry and his co-authors give is that you can build a sandcastle at the beach, but maybe not like on Paulista Avenue in Sao Paulo, right? But that affords a different kind of performance. But there's something else that goes into this hybrid mix, which is the images and the narratives that make up the place and the way that we relate to the place. So Barinholtz et al. Right, places are not only or even primarily visited for their immanent attributes, right, like their physical attributes, but also, and more centrally, to be woven into the webs of stories and narratives people produce when they sustain and construct their social identities. So it is a thoroughly relational understanding of place. And so more and more places are woven into these narratives, into cinematic narratives, into cyberspace, into augmented and virtual geographies that are overlaid onto the physical space that allow tourists to perform those places in particular ways. And this brings us to the seventh point, which is that tourism is not isolated from everyday life. It's intertwined with all of these narratives that circulate about the place, but it's also intertwined with the obligations, the social relations, and the other practices that people are performing, whether they are technically tourists or not. And so the distinction between tourism and other categories or realms of social life are blurred. And then the final point they make, which I'm not going to say anything about right now, but I will come back to it if we have time, is, sorry, I missed it. Oh, yeah. Yes. Is that understanding place this way requires innovative methods. So we'll see how we're doing with time, if we have time to talk about methods. Okay, so these 8 insights, they offer this intellectual pathway for thinking about the ontological and epistemological implications of bringing performance theory to the intersection of tourism studies and the mobilities paradigm. But I want to just turn now to think about where tourism lands in Urry's Mobilities Manifesto. Now, given the way that the tourist gaze centered tourism in the sociological agenda, it's kind of interesting to then look at Urry's later work and think about where tourism is in that later work. Because in Sociology Beyond Societies, which he published in 2000, in the new mobilities paradigm that he wrote with Mimi Sheller, in Mobilities, and these other texts where he's really laying out his manifesto for a mobile sociology, tourism is just kind of like in there, right? It's just in there with all these other kinds of mobilities. At the very start of Sociology Beyond Societies, he says, I seek to present a manifesto for a sociology that examines the diverse mobilities of peoples, objects, images, information, and wastes, and of the complex interdependencies between and social consequences of these diverse mobilities. And then, sorry to be flying through this, and then he lists all the mobilities, right? And where is tourism? It's there, but it's like number 10, right? It's not number 1. It's number 10. And so this is why I'm thinking that although Urry really centered tourism in the tourist gaze, in his later work he kind of decentered it. So instead of establishing really strict categorical boundaries between these forms, what he's emphasizing is how all of these mobilities overlap and impinge upon each other as part of a system, a mobilities system, right? So tourism is part of a mobility system that also is made up by all these other kinds of mobilities, all of which are interdependent. So he's kind of making tourism relative to these multiple mobilities and immobilities of social life. And the Center for Mobilities Research in particular, and the field of mobility studies more generally, has been a home to scholars whose interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary work, as Mimi reminded us last night, intersects with tourism, but it doesn't fit neatly into any disciplinary box. I think a great example of this is the wide-ranging work of Rodante Zanelli, one of my colleagues at the University of Leeds, whose books engage with things like cinematic tourism, thanatourism, so-called slum tourism, the Rio Olympics, but also like cosmopolitanism and magical realism, digital media, art, critical cultural analyses of the pandemic and planetary crises, right? So she's not like boxed into just tourism. She uses the mobilities paradigm to open up onto all these other really interesting, creative, and I think courageous questions. So scholars who align themselves with the mobilities paradigm are conducting research on art, design, activism, digital media cultures, visual, social, and spatial technologies, historical, post-colonial, decolonial studies, critical development studies, humanitarian and volunteer tourism, immigration and refugee mobilities, climate change and environmental justice and mobilities justice, transportation and urban planning, mobile lifestyles, heritage. My list is very long. But you see how the mobilities paradigm lets us kind of moor ourselves with tourism, but then also propels us in all these other different directions. And that is it allows us to do more than tourism. So Urry's Mobilities Manifesto invites us to think about tourism mobilities not from a particular specialized corner of academia, but as part of these broader mobility systems in a way that defies disciplinary boundaries and spills over these categorical confines and reworks social scientific methodologies. And this is the invitation that I have like RSVP'd to, that I've said yes to in my work. So for example, the book Mobilizing Hospitality, the Ethics of Social Relations in a Mobile World that I co-edited with Sarah Gibson, who was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Mobilities Research when I was. We brought together scholars from several different disciplines to think about dissolving those disciplinary borders between tourism studies and immigration studies and between tourism and hospitality. And the mobilities paradigm has been an intellectual mooring for my subsequent work as well, especially when it didn't exactly line up with tourist studies. So like I said earlier, I've studied couchsurfers, flashpackers, worldschoolers, transnational families, and digital nomads, all forms of interactive travel, mobile sociality, or mobile lifestyles. Like this is the book about the world-schooling families. Sometimes they're tourists, like they might be a tourist on Tuesday. Sometimes they're parents. Maybe they'll go to a museum in the afternoon, right? So you can't say that they are exactly tourists, but tourism is absolutely infused in the way they practice their lifestyle. So to return to the point I made at the beginning, these mobilities revolve around complex combinations of movement and stillness, realities and fantasies, and play and work. And in my research, I've explored how the integration of mobile and social technologies are troubling these distinctions between home and away, hosts and guests, autonomy or escape, and community or obligation, work and leisure, or tourist and immigration categories. And so what's most interesting to me about the mobile selves and the mobile lifestyles I study isn't whether or not world schoolers or digital nomads are tourists, but rather how do they play with that idea of tourism? How do they alternately embrace being tourists and then also reject being tourists as they kind of leverage their privilege and their resources to live the lives that they want to live? And so the mobilities paradigm has given me the theoretical and the methodological tools and the freedom to ask those questions. So I think I'll stop there because I think I'm past time, right? Really? Do you want to hear something about methods, or do you want me to stop? Okay. So I should have started with methods. Okay, sorry. It's the sobremesa, the dessert. will be methods. Is that the right word? I don't know. Okay, so maybe we'll talk about methods a little bit. Okay, so this question: what kind of world does mobility make, and what kind of world does mobility make knowable? So I have kind of distilled a few points from the discussions around mobile methods that maybe I can just highlight, but then maybe we talk more about it with your questions. Okay, so one of the main things that the mobility scholars were interested in is, how do you study something that is on the move, that is in process, that is relational? This was Mauricio's question last night, right? Like, where is that relationality? How do you study that without pinning it down and making it no longer mobile, right? So these sedentary methods were maybe appropriate when sociology's unit of analysis was imagined as a geographically bounded and static society, but a sociology that puts mobilities at the heart of its intellectual agenda requires these kind of nimble and innovative mobile methods for studying emerging mobile empirical phenomena. The second point is that mobile methods are very much informed by the reflexivity of performance theory. So studying mobilities and mobilizing research techniques, it's not just about, this is quoting from Monica Buscher, John Urry, and Katarina Witschger's book, Mobile Methods. So studying mobilities and mobilizing research methods, it's not just about how we make knowledge of the world, but how we physically and socially make the world through ways we move and mobilize people, objects, information, and ideas. And so here, this is a very reflexive idea that as researchers, when we begin to study and explore something that interests us, we are not innocent anymore, right? We are in it. We are also making it what it is, and we are making it knowable in a particular way. The third point that has inspired me is this idea of a vital sociology. And here I'm quoting from a really interesting paper that Mimi Sheller has published on the mobilities paradigm in alive sociology. And she's calling here for this idea of alive methods. She says that one of our current challenges is to reinvent forms of attentiveness, right? Like how do we pay attention? How do we attune to that are mobile and can respond precisely to admit the fleeting, the tacit, like the unsaid, the not necessarily represented, the mobile, the chaotic, the complex. This is the future direction for sociology of mobilities as a live, lively, or alive sociology, attentive to its own emergence. So this means that research methods, as Urry puts it, need to be on the move and, in effect, to simulate in various ways the many and interdependent forms of intermittent movement of people, images, information, and objects. And so that is what I was trying to do then with my concept of mobile virtual ethnography. So I was trying to mobilize a live sociology, and with mobile virtual ethnography, which I write about mostly in this book, and then a little bit, I did it. That was the methodology I used for this book, but I write about it a little bit in here. So the idea is that you are mobile, both physically mobile with the people or the phenomenon that you're interested in studying, but you're also mobile virtually, because the lifestyles of these families, for example, doesn't just happen in person, and it doesn't just happen online, but it is the two are completely intertwined. So the way they're traveling and the way they are reproducing their travels in their blogs, in their social media sites, and so forth, that's all part of what I was interested in. So with mobile virtual ethnography, the researcher isn't immersed in a field site, but is sort of following people around to many different sites, both physical sites and virtual sites. So for example, in the research I did for the world schooling families, I became a world schooling parent, and I took my son out of school for 5th grade. He was 10 years old, and we traveled around the world. We went to all 7 continents, and I tried to go to the hubs where the world schooling families like to meet up, and then I would try to meet them, and my son was my research assistant, and so he would be like, "Mom, I think that's a world schooling family. Should I go try to play with the kids?" And I'd say, "Yes, yeah, go play with them." And so he would help. It's better than snowballing, right? Just have a little kid. It's also about attuning to the mobilities, but also the immobilities and the stillness, right? So as much as I was out there traveling, I spent way more hours just in a chair with my computer. And then the mobile virtual ethnography is reflexive, as I was saying, in the sense that it's like reproducing the sociabilities and the mobilities that it seeks to explore. Now, this method, it works for my questions because I'm interested in mobile sociality. I'm interested in how people are doing togetherness on the move, using technologies to be together or to be apart. So in my case, it works. I don't know that it's necessarily the best methodology for every question or for every research design, but in my case, it allowed me to kind of be with the people I was interested in studying in ways that also simulated, as Urry puts it, how they were being sociable. And so a lot of my interactions with these people consisted of a lot of online to offline communication, which is what I was interested in studying anyway. So we would email, "Hey, are you gonna be in Barcelona on this day? Oh, well, we're gonna get there on Saturday. Right?" And so we would email, and then we would meet up and offline. It also involved a lot of walking while talking, which I think is a really interesting methodological technique. So when I would interview couchsurfers or world schooling families, we never just sat still. They always wanted to walk around and show me things. And some of my, what you might call an interview was actually a play date. And so a lot of the families that I interviewed for the study were already using technology to meet each other so their kids could play together. And so I would reach out to say, "Hey, can I come and interview you at the place where you're staying?" And they would say, "Sure, the kids will have a great time." And it would turn into a play date, and I would have to remind them, like, "I'm a sociologist, and I have this informed consent form for you." But they just wanted the kids to play, and it was just like a play date. And the same thing when I was doing my research on the hospitality platforms and interviewing couch surfers. I'd like to come and visit with you and interview you for my sociological research project, and they would host me and want me to stay for dinner and want me to stay at their place. And so rather than being strictly an interview, it became a hospitality encounter that in many ways simulated the way they were also interacting with other couch surfers. So I guess the methodological techniques, the innovations, the interventions, I'm really curious to hear what you're using, what you're where your frictions are with your methods, where things have gone well, what things are working or aren't working. But I think that depending on what your research questions are, to me, what mobile methods sort of boils down to is finding new ways of being with people who are finding new ways of being in and creating the world. Okay, so I will really stop now. Thank you. Sorry that went really long.
Bom, devem ter gostado, né? Imagino. Bom, circulou aí a apresentação em português. Eu identifiquei alguns pequenos erros. Peço desculpa pela imprecisão na tradução aqui e ali. Soube que o grupo ali atrás, um colega estava traduzindo para os outros ali no grupo. Então, assim que a gente vai se resolvendo, né? A gente tem um tempo interessante ainda para perguntas. Então, se vocês quiserem fazer perguntas, ou vindo aqui falar em inglês, ou fazendo em português e alguém traduz, ou se quiserem escrever e a gente traz aqui também para Jennie, pode ser, tá? Tá aberto. Não? Adriana. Nope. They're shy. No? Okay. Yes, always. There's a question here. Você pode vir aqui? Para ouvir a tua voz e ficar na gravação.
Pode ser comentário, né? Pode ser, precisa ser pergunta. Lógico. Primeiro, boa tarde. Tudo bom, professora? How are you? Tudo bem, gente? Tiago, vou falar em português. I'm going to speak in Portuguese because I have some students here and I don't know if they understand totally in English. Então, vou fazer o comentário em português para os meus alunos. Those are my students. Levanta a mão aí, pessoal. They are cute, right? Very cute. They are in high school now. Yeah, they are in high school, but they study tourism. Ok? Vou fazer o comentário, Tiago, e aí eu acho que... Você traduz para ela depois? Tá? Tá, beleza. Gente, alguns de vocês já sabem, me conhecem, eu dou aula na ITEC, na Camargo Aranha, para o curso de guia de turismo. Trouxe meus alunos hoje. E aí, hoje eu estava discutindo mobilidades com a amiga, com a Denise, que vocês também conhecem. E alguns dos meus alunos estão fazendo TCC agora. Inclusive, 2 deles estão falando sobre criar um roteiro turístico para falar da história e do futebol ao mesmo tempo, só que na Zona Leste, que é reconhecidamente uma zona periférica de São Paulo. Então, a proposta deles, na verdade, não é reproduzir um roteiro turístico que já existe, de visitar estádio, mas sim de tentar atrelar o social, a história, e o futebol, que é uma coisa que eles gostam bastante. E isso não foi ideia minha, porque eu não sei nada de futebol, como um bom gay. Desculpa a homofobia. Desculpa. Sorry. E aí, eu não sei se eles entenderam tudo, Tiago, eu estou fazendo esse comentário, eu não sei se eles entenderam tudo ou parte da apresentação, mas eu, até o momento que eu toquei o João e o Enzo, falei, olha, o que vocês estão fazendo é um trabalho de mobilidades. Vocês estão tentando criar lugares que não são vistos pelas mobilidades digitais, de trazer o que é turismo. Porque o que é turismo? É visitar os estádios. Mas, em nenhum momento, é entender a história e a importância do social do futebol na Zona Leste, que é uma região periférica. Apesar de eles estarem no ensino médio, já vou terminar, eu juro. Apesar de eles estarem no ensino médio, eu não quero que o trabalho de TCC deles vire uma coisa encadernada. Encadernada que eu digo, não vá para o mundo. E aí eles estão criando lugares, mesmo estando no ensino médio. Então, tão novos, com tanta responsabilidade. Então, queria agradecer. Thank you so much. Traduz isso para ela, já, pelo amor de Deus.
Can you translate it to the students? Yes, I can. Okay. Thank you very much for your comments. Can I tell you a little story about myself? When I was 17 years old, I left the United States. I went to Italy. I was an exchange student. And the school I attended in Italy was for tourism. So maybe similar to you and your students. And it was wonderful. I was learning how to be a travel agent, how to make the itineraries. So welcome. Thank you for coming. Yeah, and this idea about bringing the different elements of the city together with football and these events as a way of performing the place is really nice. So the students are making a project now to do that. Excellent. So bringing your own knowledge and your own interests about the place into a way to help other people perform the place. Yeah, wonderful. Maybe I can come on the tour when it's ready.
Let me just make brief.
Okay.
Ela me pediu para traduzir uma parte do que ela disse, mas ela disse que com 17 anos foi fazer uma viagem como estudante para Tá desligado. Com 17 anos ela foi para a Itália estudar e o ensino, uma parte do ensino médio que ela fez era justamente numa escola de turismo, justamente na parte de agenciamento, né? Elogiou vocês pelo fato de trazerem as suas referências, os seus conhecimentos, as suas histórias de vida num novo projeto, né? E se convidou para fazer o tour com vocês na hora que a proposta estiver pronta. Mais perguntas ou comentários, gente? Eu achei que tem várias. Você pode...
Hi, I'm Vivian. I'm a student, and I would like to know your personal opinion about something that you've been studying, but it's really your personal opinion about the backpackers, because in Brazil, a lot of people will be backpackers because they cannot travel any other way. But I know for the foreigners, especially in countries where the currency is strong, they can travel. They can stay in 5-star hotels, but they prefer traveling as a backpacker. So I would like for you to talk a little bit about it, if you can. Traduzindo, eu perguntei para ela sobre os mochileiros, porque aqui no Brasil muita gente é mochileiro porque não consegue viajar de outro jeito, porque a nossa mão é fraca e etc. Mas em alguns países, mesmo países que Estados Unidos ou Noruega, que o dinheiro deles é alto, eles conseguem viajar ficando em hotéis 5 estrelas, mas eles são mochileiros porque eles querem, né? Eles têm um estilo de vida diferente, e eu pedi para ela comentar a opinião dela pessoal sobre isso.
Thank you for that question. I think that's an incredibly important question. And I think that what it actually gets at is this idea about how privilege is reproduced through mobilities, but also through narratives and imaginaries about mobility, and whose style or art of travel is seen as cool, hip, adventurous, versus whose style of travel is out of necessity. And I think that your question reminds me a lot about the trend of slow tourism, and this idea that a lot of middle-class, wealthy travelers are adopting slow travel as a kind of way of transmitting a certain identity about themselves or a certain value system about themselves. And it's moralized, it becomes a moral question that because they are traveling slowly, they are somehow better, or they are traveling lighter on the earth or something like this, without any acknowledgement about all the people in the world who are traveling slowly because that's the only way they can travel, right? And that their slow travel is not similarly celebrated. I think, is that what you're getting at a little bit with your question? Yeah, and so with the backpackers, it's, I think Tim Cresswell, who's a geographer who studies movement, talks about how movement is always meaningful, and who has the power over that meaning is almost as important as who has the power over the mobility itself, the actual physical mobility itself. and which travelers get to present their mobilities as cool or sustainable also has to do with who has network capital, who has access to be able to have like a platform for promoting themselves around the world as like a cool backpacker versus someone who doesn't have access to telling their own story in that way. So I don't know if that. Yeah.
Gente, eu vou tentar fazer traduções parciais, só das ideias principais, tá? Uma das formas de responder a pergunta aqui ela mobilizou a ideia de privilégio, né? Alguns grupos são privilegiados a ponto de promoverem seu estilo de viagem como algo descolado, diferente, e outros, como a Vivian falou, viajam assim por não ter outra opção, né? Então, um comentário meu agora, a resposta da Jennie foi bem no formato problematizador de uma socióloga, né? Existe, de um lado, a viagem que é performada para se mostrar um estilo de vida e aquela que é feita por ser a única forma de se poder viajar quando existe restrição de recursos, por exemplo. Só para trazer outros dois elementos que ela comentou, ela fez um comparativo com o slow tourism, né? A gente não traduz muito slow tourism em português, enfim, viagens lentas, que muitas vezes são usadas e performadas e promovidas por quem faz a partir de uma plataforma moral, né? Do tipo assim, eu estou viajando de forma mais leve e, portanto, o mundo deveria me seguir porque é mais responsável. Como se fosse possível todo mundo fazer isso, né? Então, é um pouco a problematização que ela colocou aqui. Um outro conceito interessante que ela falou é o capital de rede, né? Que é uma coisa que aparece muito nos textos sobre mobilidades, em algumas áreas da sociologia, inclusive, que é um jeito, inclusive, de mobilizar possibilidades de fazer uma coisa ou outra, né? Então, nem sempre todo mundo vai ter capital de rede para fazer e promover-se da forma como certos mochileiros fazem por estilo de vida, né? Não por necessidade. E o último comentário, para vocês registrarem, quem não conhece, ela mencionou um geógrafo, um pesquisador, que é uma das referências mais assim, elementares para se estudar mobilidades, que é o Tim Kressel. Se vocês quiserem procurar, Tim, né? T-I-M, Kressel. Que também é uma fonte importante de estudos de mobilidades, que pode ser interessante e útil. I'm trying to do my best. Você vem cá, Maurício? Você vai fazer inglês e português, né? Primeiro inglês. Tá.
Jennie, thank you so much for your presentation. And my question is about the changing understandings of the tourist gaze, as we now have the translation of the third edition of the tourist gaze. And in this last edition, the tourist gaze was redefined, like as being embodied and multisensorial, and not only about the visual sense. Also, John and Larson were, I think, embracing some of the critiques on its earlier version and emphasis on visuality only. And now the tourist gaze became more about performativity. You mentioned like the performative theory and performative turn that dialogued with mobilities turn, and more about the social relations also, like between the gazer and the gazees, the consumer tourists and the service workers also. So how do you think about this change of emphasis from visuality to embodied practices and or performances, and to the importance of interaction, interactivity, sociality, conviviality in mobility's approach? like the later work of John Urry, he was, I think, emphasizing a lot this dimension of the social relations, social ties. This is evident in network capital you mentioned. Like, it's a bit like just to know a bit about how your view on this, like changing of emphasis. Ah, é sim, desculpa. Não, então, é sobre a mudança do entendimento sobre o olhar do turista. Que na terceira edição, que foi traduzida agora pelo SESC, o olhar foi um pouco redefinido com relação à primeira edição, que era de 1990, e tinha uma ênfase muito na paisagem, na visualidade, no olhar visual, né? E aí a nova edição enfatiza muito a questão das práticas corporificadas do turista, da performance, e também das relações entre aquele que olha e aquele que é olhado, assim, entre o turista, o consumidor e os trabalhadores. Então, aí há uma mudança na própria perspectiva das mobilidades nessa direção, na direção de enfatizar mais essas interações, interatividade, relações sociais que são implicadas no olhar do turista. E não só a dimensão visual mesmo, das paisagens, etc. E aí eu perguntei qual é a visão dela sobre essa mudança de ênfase.
Deixa eu responder primeiro, tá longa. She wanted to add something. Is it okay, or you want to answer before?
Yeah, I kind of want Mimi to answer. But thank you, Mauricio. And I should say thank you to Mauricio and Amanda for getting us here today. Thank you.
It's all about mobility.
Yes, it is all about mobility. What I think, Mauricio, actually is what we see. I don't know. Maybe you have a different way of thinking about this, Mimi. But when I look at the 3 editions of the tourist gaze, and also knowing what John was doing at the same time in his other work, I think we see how much his other work was impacting the way he was thinking about the tourist gaze and reworking the tourist gaze. And so we see his engagement with the performing tourist places with Jürgen Ole Berenholt and Michael Haldrup and Jonas Larsson. He went to Denmark to work with them. They all came to Lancaster as well. And so they were really, I think, developing this idea of performance for tourism. So we can see how those collaborations were feeding back into the way he was thinking about the tourist gaze, especially around performance. And then by the 3rd edition, I think we really see the mobilities paradigm really, really impacted the way he's thinking about tourism. So I don't know if I quite answers all your questions about the relationality and interaction, but I think Mimi knows this better than I do.
So I think a good way to think about this is, and let me say, I also brought a book for the library. So add that to the bag. Island Futures. And I hope this is an okay subject for me to talk about, but let me draw a distinction of thinking about the gaze. I know there's a lot of feminist critique that the gaze is masculine. The male gaze objectifies the woman or other people's bodies. And if you think of tourism through the gaze as objectifying the other's body, and what in cinema theory is called a scopic regime, right, of looking, take that idea and then put a body in it and think about sex tourism. And there's a difference between looking at something, representing something visually, in media, in film, in postcards, on a stage, versus purchasing sex and expecting somebody to provide that service work for you. And so the criticism, in a way, of the gaze is, as a way to understand tourism, is that it doesn't actually recognize the unequal power relations that are mobilized in those moments of service work within tourism, and that it's much more exploitative than just looking at somebody. And in that book, Island Futures, one of the things I'm doing is taking the research relationship, to go to mobile methods, where you go somewhere and you're doing research. And I was in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, Haiti, researching the aftermath of the earthquake, but using a reflexive tourist gaze 3.0 kind of lens. I was very aware that our research team of men and women, there was Americans and Germans and Haitians, and we were all traveling together. We were a kind of tourist assemblage also. And our tourist assemblage, just being there as researchers in this devastating post-earthquake situation, is a terrible power inequality. Our ability to move, our ability to be there, to get food, to get electricity, internet connections, to have vaccinations against malaria drugs, and all of these things that enabled us to be mobile while people around us were dying. We're living in tents in the mud and couldn't get clean water. We're getting cholera that was brought by the UN. And so, like, bringing all those really serious topics, but using the tourist gaze as a way to understand what was going on there. And it was fully dimensional. We weren't just looking, we were impacting the place.
Rapidinho, assim, só porque eu acho que é importante tentar fazer umas pedaços de tradução, né? Tem uma ideia importante que a Jennie colocou, que é a ideia que ela apresentou ali, ela reforçou na resposta, né? A performance como uma referência para complexificar a ideia de olhar, né? Que o olhar não é apenas o posicionamento mecânico dos olhos, né? A composição fisiológica do nosso corpo, enxergando, produzindo as nossas imagens para o cérebro. Tem um conjunto de elementos que dizem respeito à colocação e à articulação dos corpos em relação a outros corpos e em relação aos espaços, né? Então, quando o Maurício pergunta sobre esse desenvolvimento, né, da ideia do olhar entre a primeira edição do livro e a terceira, né, vai ficando claro, e você percebe, que essa ideia, ou melhor, esse grande arcabouço das mobilidades, ele vem para o primeiro plano da terceira edição do livro. Isso é uma coisa que a gente costuma destacar quando fala da importância do Olhar do Turista 3.0, que ele não é apenas um livro sobre turismo, mas um livro sobre como, ao tratar de turismo, a gente está também trazendo o debate sobre as mobilidades como uma referência analítica, né? E é justamente o que a Mimi comentou agora, compartilhando um pouco a experiência dela de pesquisadora no Haiti, né? Ela faz muita pesquisa na América, nas ilhas do Caribe, e teve lá em 2010, logo depois do terremoto. E para mim, ouvir isso chega até a arrepiar, assim, porque ela fala, a gente estava usando a referência do olhar do turista, mas na condição de pesquisadores, né? Nós tínhamos todo aquele aparato que normalmente está disponível para pessoas com mobilidades privilegiadas, por exemplo, turistas, mas para tentar atuar, trabalhar, pesquisar num ambiente absolutamente destruído. Então, existe um contraste que é muito, muito interessante entre todo a ideia que se desenvolve ao redor do olhar do turista como categoria de análise, né, para aquilo que não é necessariamente um estudo sobre uma prática ou um destino turístico, que era um país devastado por um terremoto, né? Então, é muito interessante ouvir isso. That's now me talking. Porque a gente consegue transcender a especificidade do estudo do turismo para outros campos sociais contemporâneos, né? E isso eu acho que isso é uma riqueza, uma importância de se convergir os estudos de mobilidade e de turismo. A gente vai muito além da obviedade, daquela prática explícita de turismo como elemento mercadológico, por exemplo, como prática de trocas comerciais, né? Existem muitas outras coisas que se aproximam usando esse olhar do turista como referência para a compreensão. E por isso que é tão importante parar uma semana das nossas vidas para fazer uma escola de mobilidades a cada 2 anos, né? A Ana queria fazer um comentário. Mas fala.
Enquanto o Maurício falava, e também... Bom, boa tarde, Ana Paula, Universidade Federal Fluminense. Enquanto o Maurício falava, eu estava retomando a fala delas lá do SESC e a da Mimi de ontem também. E eu queria fazer uma observação que vai ao encontro do último comentário do Thiago, nesse sentido, obrigada por ter pedido para esperar, porque desde o primeiro olhar do turista, 90, né? Depois a segunda edição e a terceira edição, que a gente recebe aqui em 2021, mas que, na verdade, é de 2011, acabei de pedir para mim me fazer o 4.0, né? Já se vão 12 anos. O quanto esse grupo que vem estudando mobilidade amadureceu, né, nessas 4 décadas, e o quanto eles têm nos desafiado a amadurecer numa velocidade talvez muito maior, e com desafios de aprendizado gigantescos. Então, para mim também, que olho, né, com os óculos da hospitalidade, não vem só mobilizing or mooring, vem também uma palavra que a Jennie tem usado nos últimos escritos dela, e que, para mim, foi o texto Mobilizing Hospitality, was the paper that made me say, wow, you understood it. Foi o texto dela que eu li e falei, uau! Lembra que ela contou essa história no SESC? Que alguém disse para ela, se você quer fazer seu pós-doc, para pensar que livro que você leu que te fez dizer, uau! E vai atrás desse cara, vai atrás desse texto e tal. E ela tem usado uma palavra que eu acho que é fundamental para o nosso desafio de aprendizagem, e a gente não tem uma palavra em português para isso, acho, que é togetherness. Né? Olhar para a hospitalidade não mais a partir e para a mobilidade das pessoas, que invoca a relevância da hospitalidade, né, no meio da reflexão, que a gente passa a falar, ela nos desafia a deixar de falar de diferenças, de fronteiras, de mim e do outro, para falar em juntação. É a melhor palavra que eu acho para traduzir togetherness, né? É a juntação de tudo. Ajuntamento, não sei. Eu não sei se é só minha essa visão, né? Eu acho que esse grupo, o quanto elas amadureceram, eles todos que passaram pelo Seymour, por Lancaster, pelo John, e trouxeram isso, despejam isso tudo sobre nós agora, né? E meio que dizem, virem-se, corram atrás. Mas eu queria registrar essa palavrinha togetherness, o quanto ela pode nos desafiar nos próximos anos. Obrigada por virem. Thank you for being here with us, for everything.
Address some comments on togetherness. What is this about? Togetherness. How and why it's so important for hospitality and mobility studies. Because it's not easy to translate into Portuguese.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Togetherness. To like unpack that concept a little bit.
Yeah. Please. For me, togetherness connects mobility and hospitality.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think with togetherness, well, part of the reason... The magic bag. Yeah. So part of the reason I used the word togetherness is because it started with a T, like tourism and technology. So it was good for a title. But more seriously, I think I was interested in like togetherness is kind of how we are on this earth, right? Like we have to be together, like it or not. And so, how is that happening? How is mobility making that happen in ways that are both beautiful and violent? And how is hospitality allowing for certain forms of togetherness to happen, but also always the flip side of that, right? Who's also excluded? I guess my ambition or something was to try to have like a theory of mobile sociality, which I've never quite achieved that, right? I'm just like little baby steps toward that, right? Of little ideas around it, as opposed to any kind of overarching theory of it. But I think for me, like togetherness is a little bit more affective than sociality, because I don't know, it feels more, maybe even more embodied than sociality as well. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
But I'll try to make a very brief translation. Tem uma coisa importante na fala dela, que ela falou assim, olha, para mim tentar construir uma teoria social móvel é uma tarefa hercúlea, bastante complexa. Então eu tentei ir construindo uns pedacinhos. E a ideia de togetherness, de estar junto, tem muito mais a ver com relações de afeto e isso, né? Affective foi a palavra que ela usou, do que propriamente a sociabilidade, que normalmente são tratadas de forma um tanto quanto mais abstratas, né? Ou seja, é o pequeno torrãozinho, assim, pequena contribuição dela por uma parede da ciência na direção dessa sociologia, teoria social móvel, né? Como ela chamou. E eu gosto desse comentário porque nos inspira a fazer o mesmo, né? Então, quando a gente está tentando fazer estudo de turismo e mobilidades, tentando pegar na mão essa relação e ver para que serve e quais são as contribuições que cada uma das pesquisas nossas vão proporcionar, talvez a gente não vai chegar numa super e final resposta, acho que nunca, talvez, mas perceber que existem pedaços de contribuição contínuas, já está bom, né? E foi mais ou menos esse o espírito da resposta dela, pelo que eu entendi. Temos mais algumas perguntas, só que agora a gente está chegando mais ou menos no final, eu vou pegar as perguntas juntas. Vocês podem fazer as perguntas juntas e elas respondem juntos? I'll collect all the 3 questions together. Yeah, sure. Você pode vir aqui? Depois, acho que o Paulo também queria e a Marina. Vem para cá. It's a vocational school. On tourism. They come in a block. Yeah. Vocês vêm em grupo, assim que é bom.
Hi. I'm Livia.
I'm Madu.
I'm Isabella. We are from the same class as them, but our teacher didn't want to talk about us. I don't know why. And we have the same work, but we're searching something different. We are going to study the difference of tourism between 2 places that have like different income, a poor place and a rich place, really famous here, Morumbi e Paraisópolis. And we are kind of afraid of having a problem with the rich people, like they don't want to talk with us. So we want to know if you encounter something like this and what did you do? Yeah. Agora eu falo em português, né? A gente é da mesma sala que eles. O nosso trabalho vai ser um estudo de caso entre as diferenças de turismo e lazer entre o bairro de Paraisópolis e Morumbi, né, que é bem conhecido, E a gente está com medo de encontrar tipo problemas conversando com o pessoal rico do Morumbi, porque a gente acha que eles não vão estar tão solícitos a responder quanto o pessoal de Paraisópolis. Aí a gente quer saber se ela encontrou algo parecido quando ela está fazendo a pesquisa dela, e é aqui que ela fez.
Hello, my name is Paulo. Thank you for being here. And first of all, I would like to say that I've been hearing you yesterday and today, and I've been inspired to look in a different way in what I'm studying right now. I'm studying policy, and and I've been reading and been inspired by some arguments based in the relational sociology. I don't know if you know. So, and one quote that was said yesterday was that all politics are mobile. And today, what I got is what tourism is a relational product or a relational performance or experience. So then tourism policy is not just mobile by its formulation, but by its goals and its ends. So how can we understand and identify the power, ideas, and relations that are formulated and mobilized all the time, not only for building policy, but affecting people's lives, not only residents, but the tourists also. And thank you.
Oi, boa tarde. Eu sou a Marina, do Instituto Federal de São Paulo. Eu vou falar em português mesmo, porque o meu inglês não está tão bom igual dessa galera aí, não. A minha pesquisa e o que eu me proponho a estudar sempre são as pessoas com deficiência, o turismo para pessoas com deficiência. Então, eu queria saber da sua visão, né, em relação às mobilidades. Essas pessoas, visto que na sua apresentação você também falou sobre corpos, né, que o olhar que a gente tem para esse turismo dos corpos e as pessoas com deficiência, a gente considera, estou fazendo uma disciplina na psicologia que a gente fala de corpos não normativos, né? Então, a experiência deles, a partir desse turismo, é muito diferente do que a dos corpos normativos, né? As pessoas que não têm algum tipo de deficiência. Então, a sua visão em relação às mobilidades e o turismo para pessoas com deficiência. É isso.
So first, Jenny, you?
Let me answer the question about studying the wealthy places, right? And first of all, you're very cute, young, sweet. Anybody will talk to you. Just ask questions, nicely, and people will cooperate usually. And they don't always understand why you're doing what you're doing, right? And so maybe they think you want to improve tourism and make it better. So they'll listen to you. Don't worry. And I just wanted to say one thing about tourism policy mobilities is it relates also to this question of who has the power to decide things. And often it's the wealthy developers. Tourism development, right, is a big business, and the business determines what happens. And it's really important that we democratize decision-making about tourism so that people involved in places that are being mobilized as tourist places have some say over the conditions of their work, over the conditions of how they're represented, the conditions of how much they're paid, all of those things. And in some ways, a lot of the new technologies, like Uber and platform technologies, take away that power more and more. People are working. Jenny we were talking about this the other day, how they're forced to work harder and harder. They they do it to themselves because of their interaction with the technology and the algorithm as a way to make money. And so we need to question that critically, and understand not just how people are exploited by, say, if you're like a maid cleaning hotel rooms, but also if you're a tech gig worker, a delivery worker, a driver, all of these different jobs. And we need to give people the more power over determining the conditions of their own labor.
Muito rapidamente, só para fazer... Bom, disseram que eles são muito queridos e, portanto, não vou ter problemas de fazer a sua pesquisa, né? Acho que a gente já concorda com isso, inclusive. E aí a resposta ao Paulo, de forma bem resumida, assim, né? Onde está o poder, né? E como esse poder é operado, como que esses processos decisórios dão acesso e permitem operar as relações de poder. Que foi o jeito que ela tentou responder a tua pergunta. Jennie.
Thank you for those wonderful questions. I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'll respond to your question first. I think this is such an important area of research, is about accessibility, normative and non-normative bodies and abilities, and also forms of neurodiversity and tourism as well. And although I haven't done research in this area, I was just writing down the name of my colleague in New Zealand, Alison McIntosh, who has done a lot of research in this area, both from a theoretical perspective, but also in terms of practical and policy implementation and methods. She has some really interesting methodological techniques for engaging with tourists, with disabled tourists and with tourists with disabilities, different disabilities. So maybe after I can give you her name. Okay. And then policy, I just agree with Mimi, of course, right? And I think that with policy, it just, as complicated as it is, the more voices and perspectives brought into the policy conversation, the better. And it's going to make for like really long meetings, and and it takes a lot of patience. But I mean, for me, I know that I just see the world in this very blinkered way. I just don't see other ways that other people are impacted until I hear their story or hear their perspective. And so I just think democratizing those decision-making processes is obviously the best way to go. How that actually happens, we leave that up to the to the policymakers. And then to the group who is studying, doing the comparison, yeah, I bet they'll talk to you. The wealthy tourists or the wealthy people in the neighborhood will talk to you. But can I just say, please do as much of that kind of research as you can, because the wealthy, one of the privileges that the elite and the kinetic elite enjoy is their chosen invisibility, right? It's very hard to see them and to see how they travel, because they're often in private jets, which we don't get to see. Or, I don't know, like if you've or in their helicopters, or if you've been even in a transnational flight. I don't know if you've been on one of these big airplanes. So if you're in the back in economy, in the cheapest seat, you're very visible to everyone on the plane. But if you're up at the front in the secret.
Just one more.
Just one?
It will be just one more, sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead,
one
go
more.
ahead.
Anyway, nobody can see you, right? Your mobilities are hidden and invisible. And so the more research that you can do on these like wealthy and elite forms of mobility, and to kind of pull that veil back, if you can get access, I really want to hear what you find out.
my side.
Together, like they share a wall. So we chose this place because it's like, and in terms of geography, they have the same privileges, you know. But one, of course, has traveled to a lot of countries, and the other doesn't. And like, we're gonna search these and like statistics and yeah.
Very sophisticated.
Yeah.
Nice student.
There's one more question from that young lady, Juliana, and I'll address you the question, and please, if you can, both of you comment. It is about a ethnographic approach on transitorial territories, meaning places that are built or produced by transitory people, such as tourists. So when we're talking about shadowing, as Paula here in Walter working in Chile, they are working with people that live there. But if you're talking about tourists, they have a very ephemeral relation with the place. So how to make good ethnographic approach on people who are not so attached to the territories? Is this right? Can you?
I think your research does that.
Am I clear, or should I?
I think so.
So you're talking about like how if you're in a place and the tourists are coming and going and coming and going, how do you do that? That's why I started looking at the digital and virtual lives of tourists, because that is more enduring, and I had more long-term access to them online and through their websites and their blogs and social media forums than if they were just like coming and going. So that's one way to do it. And maybe even it's not the exact same tourists that you meet in the place who are also in the virtual space, but you can get different perspectives that way. The other thing I think is to maybe reimagine what we think an ethnographic study is, right? Like there's Päivi Kanisto is a Finnish writer, and she did her ethnography on global nomads, and she did instant ethnography. So she would maybe only spend like one day with people, and but try to kind of, you know, engage with them as much as she could. So I don't know what your feelings are in terms of the anthropological method of immersion or, you know, like long-term field work. But if you're open to thinking about something like instant ethnography, that could be another way of engaging with people who are more mobile and sort of coming in and out of your viewpoint.
Só para vocês saberem, gente, hoje é o dia de descanso da Mimi, mas ela quis vir aqui acompanhar essa fala, então ela está aqui dando uma força para nós. I'm just saying that it should be your day off, but you decide to be here, and for our, you know, privilege. Gente, acho que é isso. A gente precisa ir encerrando, né? Estamos aqui há 2 horas nessa conversa. É bom acabar uma conversa sobre assuntos tão interessantes de forma tão curiosa, ou seja, com mais questões a buscar para a gente seguir pesquisando, seguir lendo, seguir estudando. Agora, a Jennie e a Mimi e o Walter e o Renato, que foram os nossos 4 convidados internacionais para essa SP-Mob que acabou ontem, já sabem o caminho do Brasil, já sabem o caminho da USP. Então, para nós, é uma possibilidade de continuar conversando com eles. Sugiro, quem quiser, que vocês busquem os contatos deles, peguem os e-mails, escrevam mais sobre suas pesquisas, façam perguntas. São pessoas bastante acessíveis, já puderam perceber, né? E assim a gente vai construindo juntos esse processo de pesquisa colaborativo, né? I was just saying that now you know the way to Brazil, you know the way to our university. It's easy to get in touch. So probably you receive some mails and questions and sharing experiences, because now we are closer in our research network. Togetherness, it's all about that. Jennie, thank you so much again for your visit, for your conference, for being so kind. And if you wanted to make your final words, please do it.
Thank you all so much for your kind attention. It is such a gift to engage with you in this way. Thank you, Tiago. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to engage with Mimi. I'm fangirling over Mimi all the time. So this has been a real honor for me to share the stage with her as well. And I'd love to hear more about all of your research and the things that you're doing as well. It's been fascinating hearing about the different projects everyone is doing. I'm so excited and inspired now knowing that all of this great research is happening, and that students are doing it. It's just amazing. So thank you. Thank you, Tiago.
I just want to close by also thanking you all for your attention and for being here. And I want to say to Jennie something that I think John Urry would be so proud to see where your work has gone.
Cadê a Milena? Tá aí? Cadê a Milena? Milena e o Vinícius também. These two guys that were in charge of some of the communication of your conference, and Milena has something for you as a gift. They can go there. Thank you, Milena. It was so nice. Alguém tira fotos aí, gente? Vai lá para todo mundo ver. Deixa eu só cumprimentar. Não vou deixar ela na mão, não. Vou pegar o meu que tem aqui. Tá bom, tá bom. Tá? Prazer. Jennie, open it. Tá. Então, como o público fala português, bom, na região que eu trabalho com comunidades de pescadores artesanais. Na região dos lagos, no Rio de Janeiro, na região de Costa do Sol. E esse colar ele é feito de escamas de peixe. São produzidos por um coletivo de mulheres de lá, com escamas de peixe tingida, palmito pupunha e semente de açaí. É isso. Aí é um símbolo de lá, mas principalmente uma lembrança da pesca artesanal. Quem quer traduzir, é claro que agradece. De escamas de peixe. Tá? Você não vai pôr nela? Ah, não pode. It's a necklace made of some
Fish scales from artisanal fisher. So
because she works with traditional fish scales in a community. Lindo. Gente, só uma coisa antes de todo mundo ir embora. Acabando aqui, a gente sai rapidinho ali na escadaria para fazer aquela foto clássica de todo mundo, tá? Tá. We're going to make Elaborate details aí.
Oh, okay. Okay.